Move on to the sort of basic introduction questions. So the first thing is just, what is your name? What do you study? And what's one fun fact about you?
Okay, my name is Eitan Harris. I'm an art student majoring in anthropology and archaeology. And a fun fact about me is that I'm a triplet.
Oh, cool. And the next question is, are you in a political party or campus faction?
I'm a member of the Australian Labor Party, but I am not directly involved with either of the Labor factions on campus. Although
Sure.
at one point I did join both of them.
Okay, double dipping. And how
Just,
would you?
my first time there, they're both written in such a way as you sound like that's the Labour Party, and they both are the Labour Party. But at the same time, when you're first introducing yourself to campus politics, it's quite. I think a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of the whole unity, NLS, not divide, but I guess like
Bit
back.
confusing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But now very, down with all of that.
Yeah. And broadly, how would you describe your political beliefs?
I would say I am very socially liberal. I'm definitely a huge supporter of unions, including student unionism. So very much against voluntary student unionism as a result. Yeah, I think also coming from a minority background and coming from the background of experiencing what it's like to live as a person with disability in Australia, but then also as a student, I know that there is a lot more we can do in terms of accessibility. And I think social liberalism needs to be able to account for all those diverse experiences of disadvantage. And I think, we're actually getting there. It's still a lot of work to do, but I guess that's my political perspective.
Cool. And why are you interested in running for board?
I'm interested because it's a great opportunity to use my experiences on campus as well as my skills in having effective dialogue with numerous groups to best represent them. So it's not necessarily something that I'm doing as, political, ladder climbing, because it's not. It's this will likely be like if elected, that year would likely be the year my term ends would likely be the last year of my degree. So it's not as if I'm joining the USU board so that eventually I can become, president and do all of these things. It's really that in the time that I have been on campus, I've experienced a lot of great things and a lot of not so great things. And I also want to be someone who people can come to and openly discuss where they think things can be improved, because I think that's the only way we can get better if we have accountability, but also the accessibility as a USU board.
Great. And how would you describe the role of a board director?
I think, well, as far as they have, the USU board definitely has their own regulations, but I think outside of the, I guess, legalese definitions, I think it really is to help shape the ethic of the USU board, at least in saying that this is what our priorities are and this is how we're going to get it done. But at the same time, there is certainly an ideology attached to that. And while the USU isn't as political as the SRC has been, historically, I definitely think there is a certain amount of ideology that comes to solving problems. And I think it's really important for any USU director to be able to work well with people regardless of that ideology.
Great. Okay. So we're going to move on to questions, I suppose, more about your policy and how you'd implement things in the USU. So to start off with, what are your three favorite policies and why?
So my platform, the three main aspects of my platform are discussing disability access, mental health, and also racism on campus. So in terms of disability access, one of the things that I really wanted to get, if elected, would want to get started is making sure that we're able to create safe spaces for disabled students, because ultimately there is a certain amount of experienced unconscious bias and harassment towards disabled students. And students with disabilities are often made to feel unwelcome in places. So having a space where not only are they able to manage certain elements of their disability or requirements like medical, treatments that they need to do on a regular basis, or even if it's just a space to rest, having a disability safe space also means that there's the possibility of a disability collective that can meet and gather there and best represent their needs to the USU.
Great.
In terms of, should I go on to the other three, or is
Yeah,
that?
yeah, that'd be good. Thanks.
So in terms of mental health, I've reached out to a mental health advocate to help me devise the policy because I really am a big believer of if you know someone knows more than you, reach out to them. Um, so I do think we need to focus on the most disadvantaged and and the groups of people most likely to experience mental ill health while studying. So groups like would include people with disabilities, people from ethnically and linguistically diverse backgrounds. As if you look at actually the statistics which were released by the NUS in collaboration with another organization, it also came to the conclusion that female students were much more were more likely to experience poor mental health. So I think looking at that study and going into it into further detail, looking at the mental health of female students is also very important. So, queer students, disabled students, female students, there are a lot of people who are at a heightened risk of developing mental illness and experiencing mental illness. So, while we should definitely be looking out for every student, we need to be aware that the only way we can look after every student is knowing that there are some people who are at a greater risk or are more likely to experience things to a greater extent. In terms of racism on campus, I think one of the greatest difficulties in combating racism on campus is the lack of effective definitions. So one of the examples is really that our language is constantly changing. If you look at places like 4chan, every week they're pumping out more and more racist language that is designed to be intimidating and offensive to minorities, but to the majority of the population is going to go under the radar because they don't have an understanding of that. And so one of the things that comes as a result of that is if, say, a group on campus was to say something that may not initially seem derogatory or racist, it may be derogatory and racist, and the people who are best able to define that experience are the people who are experiencing it. So I think the USU working with the affected groups to come up with a database of terms that are commonly referred to as dog whistles, things that are meant to fly under the radar but have significant and quite hurtful meanings. That's really the only way to effectively say, well, this is what's happening and this is their experience and this is how we can combat it. Because if you say racism is bad, we disagree with racism, but then you don't stipulate what really counts as racism as far as examples go, then it means that a lot of cases and a lot of experiences fall through the cracks.
All right, great. Thank you. So I think an important discussion at the moment is that the USU is currently facing unprecedented financial stress because of their loss of revenue related to COVID-19. So
Yeah.
if you had to, what would you cut from the USU's current operations? And how do you think the USU could economize?
So I think ultimately part of the USU's funding will always come from the university in terms of staff funding, but student services amenities fees, and that makes a substantial amount of our income. But we're also making income from our rental spaces as well as we've got so sales of goods and services, which are approximately $20,000, rental income of approximately 2.3 million. This is based on the 2018 financial report. They haven't published their 2019 financial report, at least not publicly on their website. So ultimately, we do have a variety of sources of income as the USU. The problem is we can't necessarily, our income from rentals and other sources, so student funding is going to decrease, but we're also likely to have a reduced staff funding for next year because that's also largely determined by how many students the university has in the year. So it is quite possible that over the course of this year and even into next year, we'll have fewer students than we did last year and the year before. So rather than having an increase of staff funding, we're very likely to have a decrease in staff funding. So we're at a double risk of being financially negatively impacted by the COVID-19 epidemic. So in terms of what we could drop, I think it has to be a matter of not saying, well, this is what we need to drop, but what do we need to keep? And the things that we need to keep are the things that bring most value to our membership, because every year we put so much, well, the USU puts so much energy into gaining members. Look at things like Welcome Week. They spend a lot of money trying to bring people to actively engage with the USU and all the things the USU do through campus clubs and societies. But we need to look at how is it that we maintain our membership from someone's first year to their second year to their third year. And the best way we can do that is maintaining our ability to represent them and to make sure that they feel like they can engage with us. So clubs and societies will always be incredibly important, but we need to continue to broadcast to students the relationship between clubs and societies and the USU, because clubs and societies are only made possible because of the USU. And I think a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of what it is the USU actually do.
Cool, thanks. So next question, what is one thing that you think the USU has done well during your time at uni?
I think, honestly, one of the greatest things has been making making USU membership free, because I had access in my first year at university, but after my first year, I came to the conclusion that it wasn't worth the financial cost of it, because it was very expensive. So after everything that they had organized last year to bring in free access, I think that's an incredible thing in terms of getting students, regardless of their financial position, to have accessibility to all the wonderful things that the USU actually offers students, whether it's clubs and societies or whether it's student unionism as a whole, which has a very powerful purpose in Australia.
Great, and now for the opposite, what's one thing you think that the USU has done poorly at your time at uni?
I think communication has been the downfall of the USU in a lot of ways. Like, ultimately, the USU has struggled since voluntary student unionism. Most, I'd say, if not all, student unions have struggled since voluntary student unionism. But ultimately, I think if you were to ask most students, they wouldn't necessarily care completely about the impact of the VSU. And I can't necessarily blame them, because I think a lot of that comes down to the USU being able to advocate on their behalf, not only what they do for students, but also what more they could do if they had the potential to do it. I think if we were to more fully combat voluntary student unionism, and I know that the USU and organizations like the SRC have been combating it for a very long time, but if we were to actually communicate to students what the potential of the USU is, on top of what they're already doing, which isn't necessarily seen, I think we'd have a lot more long-lasting engagement with the USU, and that would show in our membership.
Cool, thanks. So how political do you think that the USU should be? Should it make statements on current political issues that affect students' lives, or should it do things like provide a platform for students' political beliefs?
I think it should be about the political concerns that are directly affecting students. So while it is important that students have a place to engage in international politics and discuss all of that, they definitely should. University is a great time to learn about a wonderful array of different political and geographic things. But ultimately, the purpose of the USU is to provide services to the student body, through union membership. So as far as political statements go, I think they should only be made if it can be justified and publicly justified the benefit to the student body, and also in a way that shows and understands that a statement made to benefit one section of the student body will not negatively impact another. Because I think politically, it's not a matter of a statement being politically divisive, but certain things can hypothetically improve conditions for one group of students, but make conditions worse for another. So it really needs to be a much more universal understanding, where possible, of how things will politically impact student life, because that's what we're there for. We're there, or the USU, there to improve student life. That's what they do through clubs and societies. And while that may seem like a very simple thing of just putting people in a room together, it definitely impacts the student experience in a positive way.
Yeah, sure. Do you think you could provide an example of something you would support the USU sort of politically supporting, and then something you wouldn't?
Okay, so as far as USU supporting things politically, uh, so a couple of years ago, I should be aware, there was a USU board director who leaked information regarding the USU, so the university's collaboration with the police in terms of student protests, which is a very difficult thing. So I do think something like that is the place for the USU to make a statement on because it directly impacts students. The problem there is when individual politics may influence the ability for the USU to form as a whole body and represent the complete student body, or at least the complete student membership, union membership. So I think that it's not about this is something that we shouldn't make a statement on, this is something that we should. It really needs to be effectively and openly discussed. And I think part of that is making the USU meetings a lot more open and having fewer meetings in confidence because of course financial statements and things like that until they're ready to be published should be kept in-house because that way you can maintain contracts and everything like that. But when it comes to a decision about where the university, whether where the union sits on university issues, that's something that affects all students. And so it should be discussed in a way that all students can feel like they have been heard. So I think it's not about the individual perspective of one director over another, but an open discussion about what they should be doing.
Great, thanks. So I guess kind of extending on this, one controversial decision that the USU has made in the past was to allow the registration of Life Choice, an anti-abortion group, as a club. Many people oppose this on the basis of its potential impacts on students who have had an abortion. So what's your position on how the USU should approach controversial clubs and societies?
I think ultimately it comes down to the ability for a club or society to meet both the regulations of the USU, but also the student code of conduct. And I think when it comes to something like a pro-life or anti-abortion student society, uh, ultimately it's not a question of their political beliefs, but how they're engaging with those political beliefs. Because if it was an internal discussion about these matters, or even a genuine political debate, while I disagree with them wholeheartedly, I can understand why that should be allowed. But the problem here isn't about what their beliefs are, but how they're engaging with them publicly. And as far as I'm concerned, a lot of those public debates and public campaigns are directly negatively impacting students. And that's where the USU should step in and say, no, this isn't okay, and that's breaking our code of conduct. If it isn't breaking their code of conduct directly, the USU should be questioning why doesn't it break the code of conduct? Because I think an organization like that does cause a lot of harm to the student body.
Great answer. Okay. So next question. You mentioned Tom Rowley before, and I think kind of broadening this out, board directors have fiduciary duty to the USU, which means you have to put the board's interest above your own. And if you are perceived to have acted against its interests, you can actually be sued. Um, if there was something like egregiously bad that was happening in the USU, something like corruption or something you really disagreed with, would you consider leaking it? And if not, what would you do instead?
I think if it's something on the level of corruption, I don't think that's something that's made improved by leaking it to, for example, student media. I think if it's genuinely a form of corruption, it should be taken to the people who can best investigate that. And in this scenario, it would be the police. Or it could be, if it's one member of the board in exclusion to all of the others, then I would take that to the president of the board there, or even the like basically anyone from the financial committee who is not connected. Basically, there are lots of checks and balances to prevent that type of illegal behavior because it is illegal behavior. So ultimately, as far as I see it, I would go to the higher ups within the USU structure, and if that doesn't seem appropriate, then I would go to the police. I don't think it's something that's made more beneficial in dealing with it by going to the media and leaking it.
Sure. Are there any scenarios where you'd consider leaking?
I don't think so, because anything that is inappropriate or wrong for the USU to be doing that doesn't directly break the law is something that should be discussed in an open platform. So ultimately, it should be brought up uh, by the USU in USU meetings, in meetings that aren't held in confidence, in ways that are discussed so that students can read those minutes. And ultimately, if it's decided that that is something that's not possible, then I would understand why that's not possible, but uh, keep trying to advocate for much more public meetings and processes of the USU board.
Cool. All right, next question is, do you think that the USU is doing enough to support the international student community? If yes, what programs or initiatives do you find to be particularly successful? And if not, how could the USU better support international students?
So I think the USU are doing a lot for international students, but there is always more that can be done. I think if you look at the sheer number of ethnic and cultural and national based student societies, you can see that the university is becoming a lot more public a place to express those identities and form communities around those identities. And I think that's incredibly important. It's important that the USU can make statements when incidents of racism or discrimination happen on campus, and I think we should actively be combating that. But what's more important is cultural change, and that happens by engaging with student societies and creating a place where they can represent themselves fully and without fear on campus, and feel like if something does happen, they can turn to the USU. And I think that's why it's also important to improve our own guidelines for dealing with incidents of racism or other forms of discrimination. So
All right,
I would say, as a whole, they've done a lot, but we really need to form an open dialogue with groups who have experienced this level of racism, including the international student community, and asking them what do they think we can do more.
okay, sure. Um, if you are elected as a board member, how will you ensure that student feedback is taken into consideration when making decisions?
I think one of the key elements of that would definitely be looking at the portfolio system for the USU, because we have quite a few portfolios which are incredibly important, but asking ourselves and analyzing, are those portfolios best communicating with the groups that they represent? And they may be, but if I were to be elected, I would do everything I could to ensure that we properly investigated that to make sure that those portfolio holders are as open and accountable to the communities that they represent. But at the same time, I also believe if someone's going for one of these portfolio positions, they're doing so because it's something they genuinely care a lot about and it's part of a community that they self identify with. So it is something that they would be very willing to do anyway. I don't think it would be a contentious issue if elected to say to the fellow USU board directors, let's take a look at how open we are to students. But I think it's something that should be done.
Sure. Are there any initiatives you can think of or any ways that the board can get more sort of direct feedback from students or direct suggestions?
I think it's more about having a person responsible for all of these things. So with issues relating to specific communities and their effect, then portfolios are a wonderful way to deal with that. But then there are other issues which aren't directly related to experiences of queer identity and queer discrimination, issues of racism, disability discrimination. So if it should be made more public and there should be more awareness for the best way to get access to the USU. And I think it also should be looked into having a USU board director to be more responsible and more directly responsible for hearing those concerns of students, and that should be much more public. So not in public in the way of you have to publicly announce to the USU what you're going through, but the route of access to the USU or to be heard by the USU board should be much more openly publicated beyond just
Sure.
being emailed out there.
Yeah. Okay. So next question is, how will you ensure that the USU caters to all US or USID students?
I think there is a lot that we can do in terms of affirmative action, because ultimately you can't represent all students unless your board actually represents all students. Um, but beyond affirmative action, I think in terms of being able to support all students, regardless of their ethnic background, their religion, uh, their status of being disabled or able-bodied, there are a lot of things that need to be considered in terms of student experience. And student experience has been negatively affected by a certain amount of inaction when it comes to the experiences of those in a minority position. And that's not to say the USU hasn't been trying, but I feel like there is a certain amount of hesitation by many members of discriminated community to say, oh wait, no, the USU have done this and this and this, because they don't see it. And if they don't see it, it's because not enough is happening. And it should be made more public, because if it is made more public, then people can say, oh wait, if I've gone through this and I need to go to someone, the USU is the right person to do that. But if people can't see the purpose of the USU, that's on the USU, because all we're doing is alienating students who are having negative experiences from being able to come to us so that we can try to rectify that.
Sure. Just kind of drawing off that student experience sort of thing, given in the last couple of years, things like Manning Bar have closed, students are increasingly not on campus, students aren't engaging with student life anymore, and I imagine this will all become much worse with COVID-19. How
Yes.
do you think we can sort of reinvigorate that student life and that student experience?
Ultimately, I think, Manning Bar has been a hub for the student community, but it isn't the student community. So as far as student life goes, I think it is doing everything we can to ensure that every group on campus, every hobby or interest or community feels represented, and in that way support individual clubs and societies, but also support a certain amount of collaboration between societies, so we have an extended community on campus. So while I don't think that closing more and more sites for campus life is a good idea, I also think if it is inevitable and if that's decided is inevitable, there is still more that can be done to improve student life outside of specific locations. And whether that means encouraging student societies to do more events online or have more open access to them, then that's something that the USU can look into in terms of setting up guidelines of saying, well, if you're doing an event online, here is how the funding structure will work. Because ultimately, student union societies come from the student union, and having a clear understanding of, okay, well, if your society can't meet in person for such and such reason, then this is how your funding will be affected. Not in a way to say that if you're not meeting in person, it doesn't count and you shouldn't get funding, but to say, well, here are the sets of guidelines that you can continue to exist as a student society.
Great. So next question is, given that Michael Spencer's leaving as the Vice Chancellor and USU President Connor Werrett has asked that the USU is involved in the consideration of any new candidates, what would you be looking for in terms of Michael Spencer's replacement? Are there any particular character qualities, traits, or policies that you would support?
I don't think off the bat there is a policy statement which I think is in the best interest of the student body. I think it's a matter of being open to discussion with the student body, because ultimately there is the SRC, there's the USU, there are political groups on campus all trying to have access to the Vice Chancellor, and they should all have access to the Vice Chancellor if that's how they see best to communicate their experiences and what can be improved on campus. So it's not so much about having a Vice Chancellor who believes a set list of statements which the USU can get behind and say, this is the person for us. It's about having a Vice Chancellor who can best represent and communicate the wishes of the student body.
Okay, great. So now we just have a couple of like administrative questions essentially, just for like extra detail. So first of all, are there any candidates you particularly like or would like to make a preference deal with? And are there any that you sort of wouldn't consider making a deal with or would prefer not to work with?
I don't think it's a matter, like, I don't think there are any candidates I wouldn't make a preference deal with. I think from my experience, I've spoken to or reached out to most of the candidates already, and I will be reaching out to all the other candidates this week. There are, of course, candidates who I'm much more politically aligned with and have a very easy discourse with. And, you know, that would include Belinda from Unity. But ultimately, I think it's still very early days as far as preferences go. And I do sincerely believe that every candidate running, or at least the ones that I've spoken to, are there for the right reasons. And that's what counts for me.
Sure. Next question is just who, if anyone, is managing your campaign?
It's just me. Well, running as an independent, so it's not always easy to find a campaign manager. I think most people who are politically inclined are already associated with a specific grouping already. But at the same time, I can't rule out uh, ever gaining a political a campaign manager over the course of the campaign. But as far as I see it, I don't think it's entirely necessary for my campaign at the moment.
Sure. And then finally, what color will you be running under?
I'll be running as purple.
Nice. Okay,
One of
great.
the commonly associated colors for independent candidates.
Yeah, no, I like purple. It's a good color. All right. So that's sort of the end of the formal questions. If any of the other editors have questions, I guess they'll ask them now.
Yeah, I just had a question regarding, earlier you talked about your experience with disability, and I'm just wondering what you think about the support that the USU currently provides for students with disabilities, and what sorts of changes you would make, if any.
So in the 2017, 2019, 2020, so the USU released a report, and in that they determined one of the courses of action they wanted to take was the development of a disability action plan. And to my knowledge, I don't think any headway on that disability action plan has actually been made public. It still could very well be going on and being researched and devised. But if it's the case where that hasn't been continued, or if it hasn't been made public, I would very much want to see it continued and made public, and try to have as much open representation within the formation of that disability action plan.
Cool. And just one other thing. So earlier you mentioned that you were getting in touch with a mental health advocate. Could you give us any more details about who that is, or if, what stage you're up to with that?
Yeah, of course. So the mental health advocate is Chantel Bakak. She's been working, phenomenally for quite a while in terms of improving youth mental health, and yeah, she's been very helpful in terms of, I reached out to her and I said, this is what I think the goals of the USU should be in terms of mental health awareness and action, and how do you think is the best approach to improve things along these lines? And she came back to me, and it was brilliant. She said, okay, well, this is what you have to prioritize. This is who you need to reach out to. This is the groups that you need to the USU to be publicly connect, not publicly in like the USU supporting them or endorsing them, but saying to students, okay, well, this is who you can go to, and having that greater openness and connection with the resources that students need. So looking at a much more intersectional approach to mental health and saying, well, these are the communities most affected, so that while every student has access, we make sure that the students who may feel most disenfranchised already at the student union and the university as a whole feel like if they are experiencing something that is impacting their mental health, or they're experiencing mental illness, that the USU still has their back, and the USU can still connect them with the services that they need.
Okay, cool. That's all that I have.
Right, great. I think if that's all, we'll let you go to prepare for your interview for Oni. Thanks so much for talking with us. That was really good.